Right. Right. So from today, this is where we start really looking into writing up an aspect of your research reflexivity. We've done that before, but we start formally then focusing on different types of reflexivity so that you write a little bit of each one of these types of reflexivity, and through the process of writing about them, then you decide which of them you're going to focus on for the assignment. So basically, in the literature, we find two types of research reflexivity, and these are the personal and the functional. So we're going to explore the personal reflexivity today, and then focus on functional reflexivities, I would say in plural because there are more than one, for the following sessions up till, I think, week 10, because by week 11, then you are actually working on your assignments. Actually, you start this from week 10, but, you know, it's getting into the nitty-gritty of really telling that story that you want to tell us through your assessment. So we will go through the elements of, what is personal reflexivity, how is it expressed in the stages of planning and conducting research. Now, in this session, we only focus on the stages of planning, mainly because you are either in the process of developing your research proposal or in the process of that early stage of getting familiar with what you need to do if you belong to a bigger project. If you're in the process of conducting research, you could then think about the ways in which personal reflexivity fits into this particular stage of the process. Although the literature divides personal and functional reflexivity, they're connected. The idea of you choosing a particular type of reflexivity is to make that analysis, to develop an in-depth analysis of it. But you could always mention the interconnections between, the PE, which is personal reflexivity, with other reflexivities. Then we will just briefly talk about what functional reflexivity involves, and then we go into our group reflective practice. Now, and this is just a figure I came up with after going through the stages of the research journey last week. This is still part of the research proposal, but as the research proposal takes us through the different stages of the planning, conducting, and writing up research, we do look at how personal reflexivity influences the aims, the literature review, and the research questions, just as a start off. As I said before, personal and functional reflexivity do connect to one another. So then we have the first people talking about personal reflexivity and types of reflexivity. And this is Sue Wilkinson, like the Ellen Wilkinson building. So she does talk about distinguishing personal and functional aspects. So the personal will be always connected with the identity of the researcher, and the functional is more connected to the processes of doing research. But again, your identity, who you are, will shape that research. And we've seen from sessions before of that mutual shaping influence is important to recognize and acknowledge. Her work is seminal in the way in which reflexivity has been understood. And as she develops these ideas of, what does research reflexivity involves, she does have this particular focus of, the psychological, sociological, and feminist perspectives, which we know by looking at these perspectives, we know that they connect completely with that idea of moving away from the positivist views, which we discussed last class, to the more social constructional views of reflexivity. Then we have Russell Walsh, who's again extending the ideas of Wilkinson and basically saying, okay, so we do have personal and functional reflexivity, but we need to make sure that that functional reflexivity is understood in comprising interpersonal, the contextual, and methodological reflexivity. And if you look at these 4 types of reflexivity, we know we can make connections straight away with what in what stages of the process of the research journey this reflexivity are more highlighted, for instance. So if I ask you the methodological, well, there's a big methodological section that you need to plan and conduct. So that will fit in your, stage of reflexivity. But as I said today, we will focus on the personal, and then the following weeks, the interpersonal, contextual, and methodological. So yes, again, Wilkinson, going back to the researcher telling the story of what are the personal interests. This is, again, you start telling us who you are, what is important to you, and if we connect this with what we've done in week 1, which is our values, then it's about expressing what your values are, your individual background, telling that story of, not only who you are, but what you like, what's important, and what social, cultural, historical, and linguistic aspects are influencing that story. Again, this is very connected to the functional reflexivity. I like that Wilkinson never talks about, she says it's important to recognize the different types, but also to understand that they're all, it's complex. It's an ecological perspective where they're all pretty much talking to each other. All these types of reflexivity. And then we have more people in the 80s, early 80s, talking about, you as the researcher need to tell us who you are, and then use yourself as a resource for making not only informed decisions, but telling the readers where these informed decisions are coming from. Again, there's a relationship between the different types of reflexivity. So if you were to talk about your own stories, your own motivations about the research that you're doing, what are the things you would be saying? That's the thing to think about. What are the social circumstances that make you interested in research, for instance? Why is it important to you to tell your story in a way through others, or motivate others to tell their story because of your own identity and your own life? So again, the idea of the researcher is part of the co-construction of a project, again, being and having an active role in the production of knowledge and social situations. We have Caetano in 2007 emphasizing this, you do need to talk about who you are. And although this is not, we've also discussed that this is not always very expressed in studies or articles that are out there, you will have the chance to do this and articulate your reflexivity in your thesis if you decide to go or to do a traditional format thesis. Will you do a traditional format?
No, I'm going to do it by public.
Yeah. So you could write about your reflexivity, publishing about it.
Okay. So would that have to come out with a perceptual?
It's a separate outcome output.
Okay. So it would have to be a different article.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it could be a different article. Hey, let's see what else. Then we have Caetano again providing this visual. Looks a bit complex, but is really not. So it, Caetano talks about the external dimension, internal dimension, and if we connect these ideas of internal and external, we go back all the way to Dewey, to Schoen, that they are talking about, what influences who we are. Self, our interactions with ourselves and others, and those internal conversations that we have on day-to-day basis mostly. That's the same information there. And then we have again Finlay, I think, but I can't remember how to pronounce it. Walsh, and more people do talking about articulating those prior experiences that influence that motivation. And it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative experience, as long as you are making that transparent and saying exactly why you decided to take this research pathway. Almost Vega also talks about talking about your assumptions, expectations. We go back to those ideas that we discussed from week 2 to week 4 about raising that tacit knowledge to the first surface by being really, really clear about analyzing those assumptions. And one of the things more recently that people have discussed is that personal reflexivity is part of the whole research journey. So it's not just what I will show you today on screen, but it does, it goes across the research journey. Let's see if we can find more practical bits. Yes, so how will it look like in the first stages when we're talking about the research aims, research questions, and your literature review? So we start from this section of planning research, for instance. You could get a gist of what kind of things you will discuss throughout the rest of the journey. And for these, very important for you to start doing your homework of what would be the best reflective model. So what kind of model will you use to then tell that story of telling people how your purposes, research purposes, connect to your personal motivations, for instance? And talking about motivations, the motivations or your aims could also come from your philosophical worldviews. And now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of, where we position ourselves in the research paradigm. We talk about ontology, epistemology, and all those kind of research paradigms. You probably you've seen this about the research paradigms with Pauline, I believe. So we think about again what ontology is. Is part of the philosophical worldviews that is interested in what is reality and what exists in the world. So what is out there? What's real? What's true? The questions that people ask when we talk about ontology. The part of philosophy that studies the essence of being. I myself always thought, oh, why do people talk about these, terms that are always very confusing to me, at least. But um, when we talk about the research paradigms, the expectation is that when you're writing your thesis or writing for publication, or even when you are bringing together different papers, that needs to be very explicit. And then we go into epistemology, which is also part of the philosophical worldviews that asks questions about how do we know what we claim to know, and how do we know that this is reality, and how do we obtain knowledge or truth, and how do we measure reality. But the thing is, if we translate those ideas to a research paradigm, again, which is related to our belief systems, or the belief systems that are already out there in the world, we could then position ourselves as, a constructivist researcher or as a transformative researcher. There are more terms that might not be covered here, because then some terms might, be a combination of these, or, these different categories, such as critical realism and all that. So if you were to say this in your research report, where you position yourself, are you looking for the truth? Are you looking for experience? Are you interested in co-constructing reality or co-constructing experience? So where do you position yourself? And I find that some students might start their research journey in, a positivism view, and they might move away from there to a more qualitative approach, either a co-constructivism or transformative or even pragmatism. Somebody said and asked to me, what if I don't know at the moment? What if I'm still figuring out? It's fine. It is part of the research journey too. The more you read, the more you understand what you want to explore and how you want to explore, then you can say, oh, I might be positioned here, And it's also situated. It is something that, a paradigm could be part of your decision-making process, and it could be situated in the stage in which you are in the research journey. So if you're planning something, you might think, well, I'm doing completely quantitative research, and then you go and start conducting research, and you find that you need more data, and then therefore you might move into a qualitative approach, and then you're moving away, or even having a mixed method approach, which could position you potentially in a transformative, research paradigm. Do you have to always subscribe to one research paradigm? I think it will depend on the research you're undertaking. So as a researcher, you might have a priority of, you are either a qualitative researcher or quantitative researcher, but still, the methodology, epistemology, and ontology will inform your decision. That's what is important. So looking at this table, where do you think you are at this moment in time so far? What would you say?
I'm stuck on my stuff, idea, like, is that helpful to theory type?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of that, but I'm not very familiar with it. I don't really know how it's gonna go downwards. Like my dissertation was constructive. I've worked on constructive projects, so I'm like more comfortable with how you can ensure quality and stuff. Yeah.
Yes. And again, that could come, you could come out after that, after undertaking research, come out from the other end and then start thinking, oh, actually, now I can position myself in here and there. So that the idea of the transformative, for instance, they do have a lot of in mind, thinking about, how does my research project will impact policy, or there's like a social agenda, there's an impact is more direct into society, into a school, into a place. So they're constantly looking into that, but also very interested in experience. So yes, you could be in both. It doesn't mean that you're wrong or right. That's where you are at the moment, and you could be there. As long as you want. How about you, Ben?
I think that my first idea is something like this, so there's actually really good that way. It's actually really quite hard to find. Pronunciation, how it relates to mental health. So I think at the moment I'm still seeking for more papers. And my ideas are still objective. So I think it will take more time for me to get more knowledge
Yeah. And sometimes you don't even have to go, because if you are in the post-positivism and you're planning a quantitative research, then you are being coherent. But if you think I'm a post-positivist, but your methodology is qualitative, then there's a gap, because then, as you said, you need to move away from these ideas to then adopt a more either constructivist or transformative approach. And what examiners want to see is that your research paradigm is coherent with the methodology that you choose. So you cannot claim for instance, I'm a positivist, and then suddenly have a methodology that carries on interviews, and you're like, oh, okay, so how does that work? They want that coherence.
And so far, my mom was I don't think I'll have use that type of books asking for my research. What I'm really thinking to work people, although it has not going related to that means for now. Yeah.
One of the worries I always encounter with my students is that they think that for qualitative research, they need a bunch of people, like they need hundreds of people, or, more than, 20 or something. They have their own figures in mind, but I have seen throughout my experiences working with PhDs, and my own experience doing research, I only had 4 research participants for my MA project, and for my PhD I had 5. But I have seen other PhD researchers are doing qualitative research that are using methods like narrative, for instance, is one of the methods I used, with 3 participants. So really, it, as I said, being coherent. So a narrative method, for instance, which is qualitative, it is positioned in the constructivist approach. And again, that's what people want to see, basically, that your research paradigm is coherent with your methodology. There's some examples here, but if you read Castle and colleagues, you do have other, labels, positivism, critical realism, interpretivism, and postmodernism. And the more you read about these labels, then sometimes they just changed the name, but they refer to, very similar ideas. But yes, so if you look at methodology, epistemology, ontology, they all need to be aligned. More names for you to then decide where you position yourself. And how do you decide on a research paradigm? What are the things you consider, so, individually? This is where you go back to what's important to you and your values and how you understand the world. So yes, just to say, for instance, you say, my idea of the world is it has to be more, in this way, then that will influence where you see yourself in that paradigm. Questions that you can ask yourself, in order to position yourself in a paradigm could be, what do I believe to be true about this topic? Do I think there is a single answer or multiple answers to my research question? And what assumptions is my research question making? These are reflective prompts which you could talk about, and those are becoming your responses to these reflective prompts are becoming your this is where you're performing your reflexivity, your personal reflexivity from the very beginning of your research project. As I was saying to you, so your philosophical worldviews need to connect to your research methods or your methodology design. And that triangulation, again, is what a lot of reviewers in your Viva, at the end of whoever is marking your dissertations, they want to see that. And they will challenge you if they see anything that is not coherent or logical. So utilizing specific terminology and sticking to it is very, very important, because some students might use different labels to refer to the same thing, and that positions them in big trouble. So you first said this, and now you're saying you're here. So what are you? This is when hedging, is very important in academic writing. So if you're saying you're using two different terms to refer to the same thing, then okay, that's clear to the reader. But what I found a lot in the UK context in academia, especially in my department, is that they always use the same phrases, same keywords. They never use something different to refer to the same thing. Never, because that just confuses the reader. So there you go, a tip for you. You probably already know that. So then more questions, if we go back to the research aims of when you start with that title that you're working on, or your keywords that are associated with your investigation, research, your statements in the description of your background, and what kind of questions can you ask yourself then to make that very explicit, especially in the description of the background. It's a lot of this is where we don't have the opportunity a lot to write about ourselves. But if we look at a traditional dissertation, a traditional thesis, it is always chapter 1 when the students tell their stories. And it's very important to tell the story, because it's so depersonalized. When I start reading, for instance, as an examiner, I start reading dissertations or even theses where they're just talking about research and the importance of a topic without a personal connection. I'm thinking, but who is this person? And why is this person interested in this project? That's what I want to read a lot. And that's always becomes that in that description of background, you telling that story, your story. You can also place your story in a social political context or in a historical context. And we've seen that in research that, those studies that came up after COVID-19, that's the first thing they mention, isn't it? Oh, education in COVID, in COVID times, the COVID-19 pandemic, the positioning, this is what's happening in the world. And a lot of things that were happening in the world that influence a lot of decisions. Also, we know where we are. So yes, chapter 1, introduction, do tell your story of who you are. Was the only chance you get? Yes.
I would do that in all of my people, so sometimes input research have description of background.
I think you can, yeah. Nothing stops you. I mean, some reviewers are very old. You know, I just wrote a paper with 3 other students, alumni actually. They're not longer students, they graduated 3 years ago. And I had a project. It wasn't hard, but it was, hard became an extension of that project. And these students were acting as facilitators of group reflective practice. And it was the first time doing group reflection. They've never had that experience, but they were all teachers. So they kind of had that confidence of leading a group. And so we wrote together a paper. It was all of reflexivity of the decision-making process, what we did, why we did what we did. So you justify and use in the literature. And then we got the reviewers, one of the reviewers' response was like, there's no methodology in this study. There's no data collection and major changes. And I'm thinking, this person didn't read the project. It says in the abstract, this is a reflective piece. It's not a report on a study. So our responses for those reviewers were like, this is a reflective piece, is not intended to report on a research study. Yeah, so how reviewers read papers is very interesting, but you always have a chance to respond to comments. And that's where you can say hello. That's not the intention. This having clear purposes, for instance. But yeah, you could add that. Why not? And then the literature review then, the kind of things, what makes a literature review reflexive? Very interesting for me as somebody who does read a lot of dissertations every year from the last 10 years. I always find students really struggling to show what they understand from the literature. So they always present the literature as what other people say. And sometimes it's like a list of this person says this person says that. And I'm thinking, that's not a literature review. A literature review is where you show your understanding. So yes, you could show that you're analyzing, you're comparing concepts and what people say, but then tell us what you say. What do you think then? Where do you position yourself in the debate? And why? Why you subscribe to certain theoretical frameworks. And that goes back to your research paradigm, and that goes back to that personal reflexivity. It's easy to connect all of these, and it's easy to talk about these, but the issue is when we need to write about it. So more reflexive prompts, that were developed by Atkinson and Morwena. I don't know if I'm saying that name right, but they propose these questions. How does my research paradigm connects to the key ideas, keywords, set methods, frameworks, models within the intellectual field? So by answering this question, you're articulating that reflexive dimension. And what are the taken for granted assumptions of an intellectual field? What is my critique of them? If you were to link these questions to a reflective model, do you have any model in mind right now? No, I do. So I think this is where we start thinking, okay, if I'm asking these questions, how do I connect these questions to a reflective model? So for instance, if we revisit Schoen's model of the stages, pre-appreciation, no?
Yeah.
What was it? Appreciation, action, and then reappreciation. So the appreciation would be more the second question. What are the taken for granted assumptions? What's my critique? So what I understand. Then the following question, which is the first one in here on the screen, would be more connected to the reappreciation stage, because there needs to be some action done, probably a text or something that you have discussed with other people or, written about, to then go, oh, here, this is how my new understandings of where I position myself are. And that's a kind of work that you need to do for your assignment, sorry, for assignment 1 and 2. More actually assignment 1, because assignment 1 for this unit is more about planning. So how would you do that? So what is the model that you use and what kind of questions would you ask in each stage? So that then you have a plan of how exactly you're going to do it for the second part of the assignment, which is actually performing that reflexivity. And then we have a question that is, what is functional reflexivity? Now, we're not going to go deep into this topic, but the functional reflexivity, just as an intro, is connected to the idea of conducting research. So rather than just planning, it's about conducting it. And because we do take different stages from, going into the field, data collection, analysis, and all that, it is divided into different other sections. But the categorization of these reflexivities are sometimes just to help the researcher to articulate and make that reflexivity more explicit. But again, it does not mean that it's separate to the personal reflexivity. So a question, for instance, that Wilkinson asks is, how is the form of our research shaped by our values, life circumstances, role in society, and ideologies? And what part does the form of our research play in creating our concepts and constructing our knowledge? Let's see. Yeah. More questions asked more recently in 2022 are, how are you making your decisions and what is your rationale behind them? We have talked about justifying your decision making and how your values impact those decisions. But that's going to be a discussion for next week, the interpersonal, contextual, and methodological. If we go into our group reflective practice, I want you to discuss the pre-task. Now, the pre-task, hopefully, if you didn't engage with it before, you start today with a pre-task, but then you do need to carry on developing it a bit further. Or write it up. If you didn't write anything, I'm making assumptions, but I know you do what you need to do. You're a really good student, so you just make sure that you do it. That's the key message. I'll stop recording, and then